let's get to the coaches poll. Why don't we? And then we will gather up some questions and comments there in the chat. Folks, you produce the show ultimately, so leave those comments and questions. But the coaches did release their poll. And while we are gaining each perspective here, starting with Matt, I'll let you guys dwell on this one. I posted a video over on the main channel, folks, to let you know what I think of the coaches poll that was just released, but more about what is the accuracy of these polls. So for the coaches poll, think about it this way. 2021, 22, 23. I looked at the last three out of the 75 teams, 25, 25, 25. How many do you think landed in the final top 25 out of those 75 teams?
40.
I was going to say I would say 40, 45. Yeah.
Which seems pretty lousy to me, right?
Yeah.
39. You guys nailed it.
Well, again, when I'm looking at, I looked at Glass. I scanned for USC right before we came on, you guys, like 2 seconds before we came on. I looked at the 25, and right away, I went down to SC at 23, and I just went, it is what it is, right? You have a season like last year. You got some question marks on defense. So yeah, we have question marks. Okay, so we're not going to be ranked very high. But then I look right down, I see Arizona ahead of us a couple spots. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, they were able to keep T-Mac. They were able to keep skill guys. But didn't they just lose Jed Fish? Didn't they just lose a ton of linemen? I just don't understand the rhyme or reason why USC gets hammered the way it does. And I'm correct me if I'm wrong. What was Arizona's record last year?
10-3.
So, they're 10-3. But who they lose to? USC?
We're not ranking the 2023 teams.
Yeah, because 10-3 doesn't matter when your head coach is no longer there. They're up in Washington. Yeah.
Maybe not. You know what? I gave my opinion to these two before we came on tonight, which is people can rank teams wherever they want preseason. Nobody's played. I don't care if San Jose State's number 1 and Fresno State's number 2 on down the line. Whatever you want to rank these teams preseason, it makes no difference to me because they're eventually going to play football. And if you've got a good football team, I care about them being ranked appropriately once they start playing. That's my concern. I understand your point, though, Tim. I definitely understand your point. However, Arizona was a really good football team last year. And I think by the end of the year, most people would have thought that they were a slightly better team than USC, even though they lost earlier in the year. And they did keep Noah Fafita and their top receiver and their top defensive player as well.
Well, they were losing. I'm not going to go into. I mean, that's fine. You lose your head coach more than anything else. Who was a big part of that offense, a big part of that
Sure.
Of what Arizona's product was, their entire culture, everything. I'm not saying they're going to be a bad team, but you would think losing your head coach and a number of guys on your defensive line and on the offensive line would have an effect on where you'd be ranked. I don't know. I mean, I don't really go into detail about these coaches polls or not. I think some of these guys, they must be looking at last year's record and throwing it together because some of it doesn't make sense.
We are.
And the problem also is when you rank people really low, there is kind of a perception, if you start up in the top 10, I mean, USC was in the top 10 for their first 5 games last year. Think about that one.
Well, sure. And they were undefeated,
right? Because they were playing the teams that, that they should beat. And they came in with the previous year's record, but they weren't a top 10 team. That's all I'm saying. And so you start that high. Conversely, if you start really low, it's really hard to dig yourself out of that. I mean, SC's got to have a chance right off the bat in the first 2 games. If they take their first 3 games, if they win game 1, game 2, and definitely game 3, they will be in the top 10. But, they drop one of those, it's going to be a bit difficult to get into that top 10 area by midseason, really.
And what I'm about to say pretty much plays into what you are saying right there in regards to the roller coaster that these sports writers play with these rankings and being too dependent on what happened last season. So I'm going to say one thing in regards to my research for years and years and years was it dawned on me 7, 8 years ago, man, these publications, for as good as they are in presenting the information and everything, Street and Smiths and Athlons and all these publications, they seemed rather conservative. Like everybody who went 8-4 last year is either going to be 8-4, 7-5, 9-3. And it dawned on me, okay, I'd like to consider how much fluctuation in these records occur from year to year. So I said 3 is the bar. And you guys have heard me go through this spiel before. And I've looked at the entire Power 5 year to year to see how many of these teams have either increased or decreased in wins by at least 3. And the Athlons of the world only predict 7 or 8 of these teams per season to have that big of a change when the number is typically in the 20s. Last year, it was 26 teams had a 3-game increase or decrease in wins from the season before. So things changed drastically. And to extend that to USC, this is what I came up with from the last 3 seasons, coming off that 2020 season with Keaton Slovis, where they went, 5-1. They were ranked 14th going into 2021. Well, what happened? They fell flat on their face. It was one of the worst USC teams of all time at 4-8 after having a top 15 preseason. So then what do you think happened the next year? Well, Lincoln Riley gained some respect. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have been unranked, but they were ranked 15th coming into 2022. They finished 13th after the Cotton Bowl, so very close there. But then, of course, there was optimism for 2023. Number 6 preseason, they were the highest ranked preseason team to finish unranked, and they finished unranked. And then here we go into 2024 at number 23. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, observations from my end. Well, first off, if people who have been following me for a long time, remember, I started writing for College Football News in 2001. So I've been covering the sport for over 20 years. If you've been following me for more than just a few years, I believe there should be no polls whatsoever until November. That we need to just collect results, measure how good teams are, see what the fluctuations are between September, early season, non-con, when you're all getting settled. And then like in November, you generally know, not in all cases, but in most cases, you generally begin to know how good each conference is, how good the various teams are. I mean, keep in mind that, the conferences try to backload their schedules so that the biggest games of the year are in November for the most part, also mid to late October, like that October 12 schedule. Like I already can't wait for that one. Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, USC, Ole Miss against, I think, either Alabama or Tennessee, something like that. Like they're like 6 or 7 huge showcase games. So I like seeing most of the season play out. Then you get an idea of not only who's good, but, when you get that weird week 2 result. We all remember Virginia Tech beating Ohio State in I think it was 2014. Like we all thought one thing about that game early, but then 2 months later it felt very different. I mean, there's always that weird game early in the season. Seems like a total head scratcher, but then the team that lost, either the team that lost gets its stuff together, or the team that sprang what seemed like an upset just becomes a great team. So by November, you begin to get a sense of those kinds of stories. So that's why I think no polls until November. We could just be evaluating football for 2 months with Mark Rogers here at the Voice of College Football. And then in November, when we have a lot more data points, then we can get around to sorting teams out. In terms of this poll and in terms of USC, for me, I love it. I love it. It's free motivation. It's free cotton candy motivation for USC. Like it didn't cost USC a thing to be placed 23rd. And like Lincoln Riley can just slap this on a bulletin board and say, hey, they think Arizona is better than you. They think Kansas State and Oklahoma State are better than you. and they think that Mario Cristobal, who hasn't coached his way out of a wet paper bag at Miami, they think he's better than USC. And may I say, on the topic of Miami and Cristobal, I mean, obviously Cristobal is feeling some heat in Miami, so locally, you know, the pressure cooker is very intense. But among national pundits and national columnists, it seems to me that there's so much more focus on Lincoln Riley's stumbles and how urgent a year this is for him at USC than it is for Mario Cristobal at Miami. Am I wrong? That just seems to be my sense, that there's a lot more ink being spilled about Lincoln than about Cristobal. And yet, if we're going to compare the two at their current stops, not talking about Cristobal at Oregon, if we're comparing Lincoln at USC versus Cristobal at Miami, like, it's not even a contest. You know, one guy had a great year and then a not so good year. The other guys had 2 bad years.
Yep.
And yet the national ink, the national spotlight does seem to fall a lot more harshly and pervasively on Lincoln Riley. So, you know, Tim mentioned, and he's right, that, you know, Lincoln Riley had an edge at Big Ten Media Days. And, you know, Gary from Dana Point in our Friday call-in show with Tim, he's expressed this, and other fans have expressed it too. Gosh, all of this is just motivational fuel. And if these guys aren't supremely driven to prove everybody wrong, if there isn't an intense fire underneath these guys' fannies, you know, something's off. Like, I'm just waiting to see everyone in that locker room play with the hunger, the desperation, and the chip on the shoulder to make a real statement. And this coaches poll is just the latest instance of that. No one respects USC. It's not going to be given. You have to take it. Let's see what the Trojans can do.
And you really don't get a lot out of interviews. These guys are very well trained, not to give away a lot. So what I was trying to do a little bit during media day was to ask guys questions just to see their facial, just see their responses. And one of the things I would start out with was I just kept saying to them, "Yeah, this has just been one long off season," just to kind of be open to just see, hopefully they'd say something or whatever, but that you just see in their faces. If you guys, fans, if you think last year was disappointment and how it stung for you, imagine the guys who were on a team last year that had to go through that and have to wait the entire offseason to get back on the field to show that wasn't this team. Imagine the guys coming in from somewhere else and their fans or their fans definitely, but their friends and family even might say, "Hey, why are you going to USC?" Right? These guys, I think, are getting ready for it. And then think about the coaching staff. I think this coaching staff knew what this team could be, and that they did fall short of where they wanted, regardless of the reasons last year. They did fall short of expectations. And then you add the optimism that this staff has, and rightfully so. Having the defensive staff they put together going into their first year in the Big Ten, I think they have a lot of reason for optimism. So I think they're all ready to get out there. And I think, once those pads get on and once they start hitting, I think it's going to become more and more real every day for them.
I also think, Matt, just to extend in your point about the comparison in terms of media scrutiny, Lincoln Riley, Mario Cristobal, not only obviously is Riley had a better 2-year stay at USC than the comparison with Cristobal, 1 game under 500 at Miami, but obviously Lincoln Riley is the much more accomplished coach overall. It's not even comparable. I just think there's an anticipation that even though I don't think most observers believe that Miami is a better football team or much of a better football team, they just think USC is going to the Big Ten, the big bad Big Ten, and they're going to have to deal with it, as opposed to Miami's got a cush schedule. They've got an easy schedule. They just flat out do. They just really, it's Florida State. Virginia Tech is their second most difficult ACC game. They open with Florida, who I think is a talented, quality team. Their record's going to not show that, but they pretty much have a 3 or 4 game season, and that's it. That's stretching it.
That is true, and I know that you studied ACC players in the off season. And there are a lot of, first team all ACC type guys on that Miami roster. But, Mario Cristobal got some highly rated guys last year, and he couldn't do anything with them. And remember, this is the guy talking about Cristobal. This is the guy who, remember, when he was at Oregon, he didn't take a knee against Stanford, and he had that Joe Pisarcik moment and lost to Stanford. You would think that once one of those instances would be enough for him to learn his lesson. But no, the Miami Georgia Tech game, it happened again. He went down that same road again. So he was but I think the Giants coach in '78 was Bill McVay, I think. So he Bill McVay'd himself twice.
I think it was Ray Perkins, wasn't it?
I don't know. Perkins hadn't gotten there yet. It was not Perkins. I think the last name was McVay. And I'm not sure if Bill McVay was like a grandfather of Sean. I don't think there's a family relation there.
Because Bill Parcells got there in '81. I think was his year.
That sounds right. And 3 years after coaching at Air Force, one of the great, seldom known facts about college football, that Bill Parcells coached a year at Air Force.